culturally created language.
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting yellow. Alright, just kind of continuing with the meandering yellow amorphous sort of forms today. I've got a little Payne's gray mixed up, some yellow ochre, deeper yellow, and a cadmium yellow pale and some white. And
a kind of autocatalytic or synergistic effect on each other. So the phonetic alphabet makes possible science, which makes possible the new industrialism, which feeds back through R&D into science, and you get and it's that information is more and more expressing its true nature, and less dependent on the medium through which it flows, which was once geological processes, then genes, now once human languages, now computer languages being iterated at tremendous speed, and where this leads, we cannot say. But where it points, we can say. It points toward transcendence. But the important thing is that there is an asymptotic acceleration. It's not simply a ramp into novelty. It's an ascendant curve which has now become almost vertical. Yeah, Mark.
It seems that something that I've been thinking about for a number of years, which brings us back into boundaries. From what we understand about the beginnings of life on Earth, it formed at the most important boundary that we know of on Earth at that time, which was the boundary between the land and the sea. But in fact, the stasis of the land and the stasis of the oceans were both insufficient conditions for the creation of self-organizing systems. That in fact, the tidal pool represents the locus, the change, the dynamism, the fact that forces, perhaps self-replicating clays, we don't know, were constantly washed and then dried and then washed, forced these systems into some sort of self-organizing principles, which became the template for what we know of as life. And this has then been repeated, because then we talk about the epigenetic transmission of information. And this then, as we've talked about earlier in this session, is the boundary between one person and another person. That in fact, it's the information when it crosses the boundary, to transverse the boundary, is to produce something different in both sides of that boundary.
Yeah, I never thought of that before, but in a prebiotic planet, from the point of view of novelty theory, the most action happening on the planet would be the intertidal zone, because every 12 hours it's being inundated and dried, inundated and dried. I mean, it's not exactly a party. It reminds me of the joke in my town. There was so little to do that on Saturday night we used to go down to Ben Franklin's and watch them uncrate freight. But when that's the only game in town, that's where you go, right? So the intertidal zone 800 million years ago was definitely where the action was on this planet. And today, where the action is where all this science, money, human ingenuity, capitalistic frenzy, all comes together in just an orgy of epigenetic effects.
Do you think the origin has any bearing on the outcome? For instance, does it make any difference whether it was an intertidal zones and self-organizing systems, or whether it was panspermia coming from God knows where? Does that make any difference for the outcome?
I wouldn't think so. I think probably all paths lead to Rome. I would bet you that even if panspermia is true, that the intertidal zone of the primitive Earth played a role in it, because that's where the energy and the free radicals and so forth would have been available.
That's where they were uncarting the freight.
Yeah, right.
Isn't that just a further barrier between the atmosphere and space?
Yeah, it's the three coming together.
Yeah, it's where the three are intersecting. With the biology and with the geology and with the terrestrial chemistry possible in the atmosphere and the hydrochemistry possible in the sea, and incipient meteorological contributions, incidental hard radiation from outer space, radioactive heat from the internal processes of the Earth, on and on and on. As when you raise the number of inputting factors, you raise the possibility of an emergent phenomenon.
Which makes the interesting points, and I'll come to you in just a second, which makes the interesting points, the liminal points, the points where the roads meet. Those are always the places where the action is.
Right.
And so if you look in the present culture where the roads meeting, well, the net is, I mean, that's it. Everything points into it now. That's where all the roads are meeting. So it's now throwing out this profusion of novelty and of new forms because it exists as an object specifically to do that. Yes. Yes, although the current theory that is that as things get faster and faster, the danger is not car crashes but parking accidents.
Of course.
You've mentioned a lot acting with heart in, well, in all our actions on the net and that sort of thing. And I wanted to ask Terrence which ideas from organic psychedelics are best at opening the heart, stimulating the heart center.
Well, somebody else might give a different answer, certainly, but I think ayahuasca, for if I understand opening the heart to mean what I think it means, psilocybin blows your mind, and if you like insects driving spaceships and visions of galactarian hegemony and machines the size of Manitoba busy about their business, psilocybin is good. Ayahuasca sort of contextualizes you in the cosmos. You feel yourself as a thing born and to die. And I don't know, it's very moving. It's also literally moving in the sense that it turns your guts inside out and reduces you to you can recapture the primitive nematodal antecedent by just discovering the real power of your gastrointestinal tract.
MDMA, and is there like an organic substance? I suppose it's something organic, MDMA or
I found that it was most interesting the first few times I did it, and then it sort of was a damped oscillation for me. But the greatest, anybody who's marketing a drug who doesn't market it as a love drug just doesn't know anything about marketing. LSD was a love drug, marijuana has been a love drug, psilocybin, 2CB, what?
Crack is doing pretty well not being marketed that way.
I'm sure
No, the
there
nickname
are
for crack.
enclaves of
The nickname for crack on the street is love.
Is that right?
Yes. Yes,
What
absolutely.
can I say? And I think the truth is that all that a very large family of alkaloidal and psychoactive agents stimulate cause arousal, CNS stimulation, which in primates means erection and hanky-panky. So given that you've heard the hype and that the context supports the activity and that you're loaded, it would be no surprise if many people felt that Eros was well served by psychedelics.
My own feeling on this, and I don't have the extensive experience in ayahuasca. I've had an ayahuasca experience, but not the one that caused ego death. It was much more mild. It was very pleasant and very cleansing. But I have always associated psilocybin with being very heart-centered. And when I was younger and needed years of therapy that I later got, I had a very, very hard time. I could take acid endlessly because it's a very intellectual sort of mind experience. But I'd always had a very hard time with mushrooms because mushrooms were pushing, in a sense, on my emotional center. me around inside of me, I couldn't do it. And now, when I'm in the mushroom, I actually find myself very, although it's intellectual and it's interesting, and there are machines the size of Manitoba, I've often found it to be very vital for the heart center.
I think intent has a lot to do with it. The most moving heart experience I ever had, or in the top 5 anyway, was on LSD. And it completely arranged my life. And, you know, I was 19 years old. I had a great deal of hostility toward my parents. I was a Marxist and of this and of that, and just tied in knots. And it undid me very dramatically, and the changes that went on that morning are all still nicely in place, thank you. So I think it has a lot to do with context and intent and what you need and how fucked up you are, you know, because any psychedelic will act psycholytically on an obsessional or a complex personality. Yeah.
Were the North American analogs less somatically challenging to you? Are they all DMT and harm are going to make you more aware?
By North American analogs, you mean Solaris and like that? The problem is that while DMT is common throughout many plants in nature, it's rarely in very concentrated form. If you're trying to get off with Solaris, you have to have a lot of it. People seem to be having a lot of luck with Mimosa hostiles and the conspecific Mexican species. Psychotria viridis remains the best source for DMT. Most DMT in the underground is synthesized. It's not plant extracted anyway.
We brought up children a couple of times. I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about the postmodern child. Yeah, the experience of going to see, I hate to say it, Spice World. But we've had so many postmodern, self-referential plays within it, and I couldn't follow the movie. And 7-year-old kids could.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, Mark Spice. I think that what you're making is a reasonable observation. It's probably getting off easy. In the fact that the environment that 7-year-olds are growing up in is so overcoded, right? There's so much flowing in so many different directions that they probably, their brain stems are probably literally different from ours. I mean, I hate to think that at 35 I can't get with it in the context of modern culture, but in some ways...
What an admission. Put that next to your name on the cover of Wired.
Yeah. Right. Wired is written for rich 45-year-olds. But Spice World was probably designed for their target audience, which is like 10-year-olds. And so it's literally built with that kind of, it's almost a catalytically, sort of self-referential engine in it. Because that's what's going to hold their attention. That's what's going to be... I mean, if movies are hypnotic forms of media, which they really are, then it takes a different type of beast to hypnotize a 10-year-old. Just the same way, I mean, I went to see Armageddon, for example, and no single shot in Armageddon is more than 2 seconds long. I'm starting to get an epileptic seizure after 45 minutes of this film. And I think it really represents what they're doing is they're doing whatever they can to hold the attention, to maintain the sort of the hypnotic illusion of the film. And the requirements for that are different for a 7 or 10-year-old because they're growing up in this environment which has caused them to really form differently in their psychic processes. What will be interesting is to see these kids when they get to 18 and 20 and start, passing through the university system and whatnot, and find out what holds their attention then.
Because of what I do, I'm in the media stream, like my personal media stream is like a really big 15-year-olds. And, what happens is they just become creators like that much earlier, that much younger. I mean, they're the ones with families, they're the ones on the website. And it's very dense, well thought out, well put together, right? Quality art direction.
Will they be able to talk to us, or will they only be able to talk to each other?
They might not be able to talk. They'll be able to talk to, people who can talk to them.
Will I be able to talk to them?
Yeah, no, I mean, just try. Just jump into that culture and see.
Okay, so can I ask a question for Terrence then?
Sure.
If we, and I think it's probably reasonable to say we probably don't want to necessarily get left behind by this, what can we look to? Is there either a drug or a ritual that can help us grow into where our kids may already be?
No, I think we have to have character models built of ourselves and turn the whole thing over into our writers. And we'll just go off to Tahiti, and the writers it's the Uncle Duke solution. If you can turn yourself into a cartoon character, you can retire, and the whole team of people will keep you au courant. This is Finn's plan for me, by the way. I think the only way to keep your career going is to retire the bod and create an online character. Saturday morning cartoon show apparently is where the action is. And then there are the Teletubbies.
Yes.
And, they take a further leap. The 15-year-old girls we're talking about can't understand the logic of the Teletubby world. How much more obscure then is it to us? And then what do the Teletubby addicts portend? They have TV sets in their stomachs. They exist in a world where the sun of LSD seems to shine all day long. And everybody's pre-verbal. How's that for an archaic revival?
So those are the Teletubby kids, the 1 to 3 year olds?
1 to 3.
The audience will be the 13-year-olds in 2012.
That's right. The child is father to the man. Yeah.
Kind of two things. One, I don't expect an answer from, but could our parents talk to us when we were 13? No. And I don't think I was too different from some of the people that I was hanging with. So I don't know about that part, and I don't have children, so I can't speak as a child today. But my first question about the multiple personas and was this a desired thing, I did get interrupted before I could get to where I wanted to be by all your faithful defenders. All those points were very good, and I was curious to hear what people were going to say to that. But really, isn't the underlying connector to the whole thing what you started talking about what we did this morning, the opening of the heart connection. So in the point that you made and a couple of the other people about how we won't be able to talk to kids because we won't be from that generation that's happening right now. Don't you talk to people through the heart? So if there are multiple personalities,
Right.
and that's, we don't know, I don't care to judge if it's a good or bad thing, but say we have 4 or 5 online characters. One is the kind of demonic, edge, sort of attractive violence, which I don't know because I don't really tend to go that way. But of all the different personalities that we could develop and explore, isn't the real thing, and I heard you start to get close to it, and that's what I was kind of waiting for you to pick up the pace with, was, is there going to be an ethics
Right.
But we have to impart onto our children so that they can make their own decisions.
Exactly.
In the future, and aren't these kids already making the decisions they
Right.
said that, geez, you know, the kids already know the truth, we're the ones who are screwed up. But which ethics for which persona is going to be appropriate? Who is going to teach or impart that information towards those ethics?
Right.
So is one persona going to be where, well, my value system really isn't towards honesty? Okay. Another person over me thought that. And that's not better or worse than mine. Is this other persona's mind going to be, my whole integrity is based upon honesty? So, do we have multiple ethics for multiple personalities? And aren't we already crowded enough in the United States with the world? And we're going to have each person with 10 more persons?
Okay. I want, you're dead on. Ideally, we want to be able to talk to our children so we can transmit values. Some of that's done through language, but I think the largest part of it is done through example. Because that speaks in a language that isn't bounded by rhetoric, and it isn't subject in most normal situations to quote-unquote poison because it's authentic. And authenticity seems to carry something of its own, or can carry something of its own. What was the rest of what you said? So there was a lot there. Well, multiple ethics.
Characteristics and acts and flows that we have with each individual setting, like I may be a different person at work than I am
Right.
in the sport that I like to do, or in the friends I hang around with,
Right.
people who I know who like to read, I like to talk about read, or people I know in the music world that like to talk music. But my more maturing that I've noticed in myself in the last years is to try and integrate all those things.
Right.
Not keep them separate and develop them individually, but to try and be the same person I am at work as I am at home, as I am in my sport, as I am in my music and my passions.
Probably this is a mistake, I would think. Probably this is a mistake. Integrating like that. I mean, I grapple with this same thing, and then if you can't do it, you define yourself as odd, where maybe the postmodern condition is actually to admit that the industrial environment is so different from the home, the learning environment is so different from either of those, that you're beating yourself on the head with some kind of print-created ethic of wholeness that is, you know, like trying to avoid venial sin or something. It just can't be done. On the question of ethics, I think, you know, nothing we've talked about here has implied that the law of karma is canceled in virtual reality.
That's right.
People who choose to be jerks will have the lives that the universe hands to jerks. And well, my experience is that you want to sort of streamline your being to move through society and business and love and disappointment and triumph with a certain amount of grace. Maybe the idea of personality needs to be in the same way that we talk about transcending culture and building a metaculture. Maybe the concept of personality needs to give way to something like the metanality. And the metanality is the truth of people that come and go from your body and your terminal, and for which you are responsible for the credit cards issued to them, and so forth and so on. I mean, that could become the definition of personality. Those people for whom you have financial responsibility and direct legal accountability.
To come back to, I invoked Gurdjieff earlier, and Gurdjieff looked at this field, this army of eyes, and said that with very careful, strenuous self-observation and work, you could at least see them coming and going, and once you could see them coming and going, you could perhaps make some, what he called a permanent magnetic center out of them. Okay, so you might, if you were really good at it, and Kerchivians are known as being a dour lot because they practice so much self-analysis. Um, um, but you could conceivably pull this into an integrated personality, which can give you a lot of flexibility. See, that's the thing it grants you in the end, is once you've got this unity, you're going to gain an enormous amount of flexibility as a result. So it's almost as if you take the ascetic path to integrate, and you do that, what you're getting is this ability to be multiple.
With that central core.
With that central core.
I mean, I learned that people have a creative personality in media. One of the groups of people that are the most well-created and financially remunerated personalities, media personalities as rappers. So Shea Jackson is not Ice Cube, Christian Miller is not Master P. Yet, especially teenagers are the most attracted to this whole world than almost anything else. And I think that it does represent kind of almost a karmic, legendary, good guys, bad guys, fighting, winning, taking over, getting paid.
Is it mythic? It's mythic.
No, when you talk about that, that's not their real personality, that's not Ice Cube's personality. I mean, what, he lives in like Buena Park and drives in every day. But I mean, fun. I mean, there used to be a pimp, or there used to be a gang, there used to I mean, he believe that.
These personalities in media, and where he starts to separate the man from the man, and does not the man become the man to many people?
To many people, the man becomes the man.
But not to him.
Not to him.
Not to him.
But what's more important?
Well,
Is it important for the...
it's crazy making to become your myth.
Yeah.
Gibson's meditation on this is the novel Idoru, which is well worth reading if you're interested in the mechanics of modern celebrity. But anybody who is involved in celebrityhood has to be cynical and ironic or completely foolish, because it's so totally and obviously manipulated in front of you. I mean, buy yourself a publicist and pay them $1,500 a month, and you'll be amazed at what happens to your life. You'll be a household word. We buy and sell celebrity by the pound these days. It's don't be fooled. I remember once I had a girlfriend whose father was a public relations guy. This was many, many years ago. And one evening we were waiting for the 11 o'clock news.
Alright, didn't pay attention to the time, lost track, and it's been 30 minutes, so you lost a few minutes of white blending there, but take two, I'm going to pick it up from here for a few more minutes, and then do a zoom in, because some of those forms are pretty interesting so far.
Over bearing type of beings in this particular time, we become enamored of our ethic, and we think it's the only ethic we have. And what I'm trying to say, I think what we're saying is at the end of history, there is a new ethic dawning. And it's going to arrive, it's going to emerge. It's emerging, we see it emerging right in front of us. And because we come out of a series and set of ethics that are different, that's very, very different from what's dawning. Even though, we may have had problems with understanding our parents' children role from this last era, this last epoch of ethic. There was things that held them together. There were commonalities. There was wisdom to be passed through the children, even if it didn't seem like they were getting it to the point. I really wonder just how much we have to give to inform the ethic that's building now. I really think that we're a footnote on it. Nothing more than a footnote on it. That's my personal belief, and I don't expect anyone to go, no.
What I hear you saying is, it is not about rock and roll.
No.
That's Get over it.
Yes.
What strikes me in this is how little attention is really paid to emotions. And Terrence, you've been very eloquent at talking about how we haven't really languaged and examined that incredibly complex, subtle dynamic that's taking place inside of us all the time, which is the emotional realm, which is ultimately what really drives us. And yet it's this mysterious realm that we're very unfamiliar with.
Nice.
And the more things take place out here, the more reactive we are inside, and yet it's uncharted territory.
Can I take this for a second?
Yeah.
One of the things we'll do tonight with the voce is the voce is a very emotional technique for communication. It's not particularly, it's not bounded by language particularly, but it's an emotional technique for communication. And I hope we haven't been leaving the emotions out in this, or to give the impression.
I didn't mean necessarily here, I just mean in this realm that is going on.
Right, and I think that what that calls for is an exploration of those techniques. And so what we want to do is start exploring tonight, or expose you to something that's an exploration of that. And to dedicate our work, insofar as our work is driven by our heart, to an exploration of those techniques.
So are we going to have a big track wall so we can zoom in and learn our settings? That's your thing.
Imagine it and it's yours.
Yeah.
This thing about emotion without language is inchoate. And so the very fact that what we're talking about here is the evolution of communication carries with it the implication of an evolution of communication. I see it already happening. Our whole sociological experience has been that of breaking down the simplistic models of what it was to be a human being we inherited from our parents in the past. And we're learning more and more about who we are. You know, we're learning about the real textured feel of racial and class differences, the real texture and feel of different gender choices and sexual preferences. This is a vast frontier. We haven't even begun to fully acknowledge the complexity of our individuality and how many different kinds of us there are. But we have to have language. Without language, it's just a kind of a leading edge of intuition that doesn't cast light very far into the future. With language, our diversity becomes this thing that is a great source of community and individual satisfaction. And so the whole project is a project of communication. And then the understanding, the heart, the community, the connectivity will just be found to have followed along with the process. It's part and parcel of it. It's strange, you know, the net is denounced as austere, the product of the engineering mentality, so forth and so on. It's the most feminine influence that Western civilization has ever allowed itself to fall under the spell of. The troubadours of the 14th century were as nothing compared to the boundary-dissolving, feminizing, permitting, nurturing nature of the net. Maybe that's why there is an overwhelming male preference for it in its early form, because that's where that was needed. But it is Sophia. It is wisdom. It is the penetrating archetypal female logos of the world soul, and leading us away from what was very sharp-edged and uncomfortable and repressive to our creativity and our sexuality and our relationships to each other and to the earth. And so this is where we find ourselves at noon. This was the morning session. I hope you've planned bathing and massages and so forth and so on. We'll meet here 4 to 6. Thank you very much.
come along to the fact that I'm still working on my vision for developing some form of networked visualization over the internet, which I'd been working on for a number of years at that point, which would allow me to perhaps continue this evocation of the planet that I felt like I was really working toward. And I subscribed to a number of mailing lists. And in a mailing list that I subscribed to, a rather good one called Fringeware, I started to see these curious little things pop up in my email. I didn't really know what they were. People seemed to be calling them URLs. And they had a very curious form, HTTP gobbledygook. Didn't really know what it was. Fortunately, I had a workstation, not a PC, but an actual Sun workstation on my desk that I recently bought and retrofitted. And I had an internet connection, and so I figured out that these artifacts were part of something called the World Wide Web. And I used the internet to go over to a site in Illinois where they were keeping what they were calling a web server and a web browser under the name of Mosaic. And I downloaded them to my computer and installed them and took a look at the configuration instructions, which were pretty easy. And whammo, my computer became web server number 330. And well, I was like, okay, but what is this web thing? And I launched the Mosaic browser. It comes up on a page, and we're all familiar with the metaphors now, that pointed to the web server at NCSA, the National Center for Computer Applications. And I went click, and bam, I was somewhere else. And instantly, I got what was going on. Because I'd spent some years earlier working on a problem called hypertext. And hypertext is the concept that words and ideas are linked implicitly as well as explicitly, so that any thought that's ever been had has relations and correlations to other thoughts. And the dream and the vision behind hypertext is to be able to make those links explicit rather than implicit, so that all documents become multiple documents. There's no such thing as an isolated fragment of text anymore. It's all one big, giant, gorgeous, heterogeneous unity. Well, it was pretty much over. I had a shit-eating grin on my face for 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, I was consulting, and I would get home from work, and I would fire up the Spark station and fire up the internet link, and I would surf the web. And at the end of the 2 weeks, I was done. And it's not because I'm a fast reader. It's just that's what was there. But I could tell. I saw it, and I said, this is the shit. And I ran to my friend Owen over there, and I said, Owen, there's this web thing. It's the shit. And I dragged him over to the Spark station, and I showed him. He's like, whatever. What I've seen better. It's whatever. And I ran and tell my other friends, it's the shit. No, I think maybe I've heard of it. And finally, after probably enough browbeating and then maybe meditating on it, I remember that Owen and I were on a Saturday afternoon in San Francisco somewhere, and he just sort of stopped short in the middle of the street and went, it is the shit. This is going to be it. This is big. Because the vision of a global hypertext system had seduced a certain segment of people who were working in computing for over 20 years. Before it had become anything like a reality, it had been something that had been driving a certain, particularly probably psychedelically influenced crowd of people who were working in computing as the reason or a reason that computers were at all useful. Well, I wasn't going to browbeat all of my other friends into accepting the reality of the web, which was still really tiny, so I devised a much more crafty scheme. There are regular, I guess you could call them house parties in San Francisco, which are called anon salons, which are actually basically rent parties for people who live down in Soma. And they open up the house and they invite people in to show weird things off, and it's an evening. And I got contacted. I said, oh yeah, let me show something off at the anon salon. And so we actually carted my Spark station across town and set it up. And I didn't tell anyone who came by that evening that I was showing them the whole of my web. As a friend came in, I sat him down and said, what's something that interests you? Botany. Click, click, click. Oh, wow! Astronomy. Click, click, click. Cool! Astrology. Click, click, click. Wow, that's great. And every one of them went away seduced by this. So this is January of 1994, and this is sort of before the hoopla had started. But I found the trick. And what we saw over the next several years, that this happened anyone, anywhere, who was anywhere near a computer and a modem. And I started keeping an index, which I called the Pesci Index, based on the number of URLs that show up in Super Bowl advertisements. And I've been very religious about this. So in 1994, the number was 0. Amazingly, in 1995, there were 2. In 1996, every single advertisement had a URL. In 1997, every single advertisement had a URL. In 1998, the figure came down. It's because they stopped running URLs at the bottom of Taco Bell ads because they just made no sense. Because the hipness of being on the web had simply become business as usual. So in 36 months, we saw this complete conflation of the web with the way people work in the world. It was, for all intents, an instantaneous change. So I was watching this as it went along, and in 1997 I stepped back from it. And I said, this is curious. It may be without precedent. And I took a look at it in that light, and I started to wonder.
All right, fun.
In fact,
That one's grown quite a bit in this session. I'm enjoying where it's headed, still not sure where that is. But that's I sort of form I decided to run with. And rather than bringing an entire face out of it, just sort of abstract the features around it. But I kind of like its sort of still non-specific placement and signification. You know, it doesn't really necessarily need to be an eye. It doesn't really look like an eye, but kind of does. And then this form appears sort of looking like a half-melted profile or something, on some shoulders maybe. So it's becoming a bit figurative, but still mostly amorphous. So fun. Right on. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Tiles, New Mexico, working on oil painting yellow. Have a good night.